Previously, in Hedge Knights, Megahoof and Sapo returned from a run to fetch Salix trees from a grove that lacked a purified meadow. The dual harvests of gossypium and flax allowed Klein to start weaving new fabrics for protective clothing. Lazarus crafted 2 hoods for Megahoof and Sapo to wear on their next Salix tree-bound journey. And they arrived at yet another glade lacking in pure meadows. Episode 36, Secrets of Salix. With an ever-growing backlog of farming work, Lazarus thought it was finally time to have both Bash and Shellbell help out around the farm. Both boys had an interest in crop tending, but up until now, Sapo and Lazarus worried about food scarcity due to failed harvests. But now crops were being left untended, and the farm had doubled in size, so the factors had changed significantly. Lazarus had also thought of asking Klein to help out around the farm too, as he clearly had a little experience with farming, but Klein had his own backlog of weaving to manage. He promised the boys their very own harvesting axes at the end of the season once all of the crops had been tended and harvested. Lazarus would have to make sure that Megahoof, Judea, and Tangier approved of the idea of the boys running around with potentially deadly tools. However, offering to forge them tools of their own was incentive enough to get them going. Megahoof and Sapo's caravan of bison crested the southern hills and entered the glade through the southern gate. They appeared just as miserable and disheveled as they did after their last adventure. Dave was the first to greet them, and tersely asked, "Again, huh?" And Megahoof nodded. 2 glades, both lacking in purified meadows, was a worrying trend. Megahoof wondered if he would need to schedule time for him to investigate the phenomenon. What worried Megahoof the most was maybe that he and the other adlets were at fault for the polluted glades. It was entirely reasonable to assume that in stripping the Catraro forest of Salix trees, they were causing the petrified meadows to collapse. He wasn't sure where the Salix trees originated from, or how they propagated, or why they were almost always found as triplets. Megahoof had hoped his research would uncover how the trees reproduced. Most of the trees he was familiar with had acorns, cones, or fruiting seeds, but the Salix lacked any semblance of seed. Maybe after the trek to the ruins, he could plan to further analyze a Salix tree, hoping to further unlock its secrets. He wanted to offer Salix trees to Hillenora Island as a way to purify his homeland, which would allow the islanders to start agriculture in earnest, rather than fungal farming cave spores. But without Salix seeds, it wasn't reasonable to transport enormously heavy trees to the island one at a time. Maybe the trees used spores, like the Nutrifungus did? Then it struck Megahoof. The trees were almost certainly dioecious, something that had been thoroughly detailed in his botany books that he had overlooked. Dioecious trees are gendered. They either produce flowers or pollen, but never both. The Salix trees produced fine pollen, but lacked flowers or fruit. There was no biological reason to produce pollen without flowers, so the obvious explanation is that every Salix tree they had was a pollen-producing male tree. So the greater question was, where were the female trees? He went to go find Sapo and Lazarus to tell them about his revelation. Sapo and Lazarus were fascinated by Megahoof's epiphany about Salix biology. Sapo chimed in that since nobody had ever seen fruiting Salix in the Catraro or Rhiza forest, it was unlikely the fabled female tree would be found anywhere near home. Megahoof agreed to his assertion. Lazarus added that it was fortunate he had just about completed an entire set of protective clothing, hypothetically allowing the adlets to travel much further without succumbing to pollution, which might come in handy if they searched for a female tree. There was still a significant amount of mystery surrounding the Salix trees, where they came from, and how they happened to spawn as triplet trees almost exclusively in boreal forests. But they were now fairly certain there was an even rarer tree, a female Salix, somewhere out in the world, and if they managed to obtain such a tree, they could sow Salix seeds to contain the pollution, rather than having to plunder what few trees their forest had to offer. They shared the news with the rest of the adlets, met with a mixed reaction of astonishment, confusion, and excitement. Megoof showed them diagrams from old botany books of dioecious trees to help them understand that trees could even have genders to begin with. And Sapo asked Dave, Klein, and Madzi to delve their own memories to try to recall if they ever saw anything like a fruiting Salix tree, but none had such recollections. Lazarus told everyone to carefully analyze any unfamiliar tree when out traveling, especially if the tree had buds, fruits, or flowers. The tree may not even remotely resemble the twisted and gnarled Salix tree, so any tree with buds or flowers that was unfamiliar warranted a closer analysis. Much later in the evening, as Megahoof was replanting the last and final Salix tree from his journey with Sapo, he heard alarm bells coming from the castle. Tangier and Madzi had spotted a large group of raiders mustering near the western boundary wall and rang the alarm bell in the pattern that indicated threats to the west. Just as Megahoof dropped what he was doing to return to the castle, a pollution-maddened rat lunged for his limbs. The alarm woke the other adlets, and Judea noticed Megahoof was missing from the formation, so she took charge and ordered the archers to head for the western merlins. Judea frantically asked Tangier and Madzi if they had seen Megahoof, and Madzi said that he had taken a few of the bison eastward to plant the final Salix tree. Judea met the news with a sigh of relief. The archers anxiously awaited for the enemy raid party to flood through the funneling gates. Lazarus grabbed his falchion and headed for the main gate, ready to cut the counterweights and slam the heavy granite slabs shut. The raid party trudged through the thick swamp only to be met with high castle walls donning arrow loops, accompanied with an incoming volley of arrows. The enemies were thrown into a chaotic disorder, one that the archers were keen to take advantage of. Megahoof rushed to join the defense. His presence was reassuring, not only to Judea, but the others as well. Sapo noticed he was bleeding and nudged him to ask if he was okay. Megahoof said it was just a stupid rat that had lunged at him while replanting the tree, and he was fine to keep fighting. Sapo pulled both Megahoof and Dave aside to stop their bleeding. Megahoof knew that rat bites could easily get infected, so he didn't put up a fight being pulled from the battle. Once Sapo had hastily bandaged them, they continued to volley arrows towards the bewildered raid party. Madzi was struck in the arm and went to go find Sapo, who hadn't returned to the Merlin battlement after having pulled both Dave and Megahoof. Sapo saw her arm was bloody and carefully examined it and told her she'd be okay. The raid party was well armed and armored, making them even more difficult than usual to cut down with arrows. Despite the quality of their gear, their attack was in total disarray, with soldiers rambling about the arrow-laden marsh. Judea took command of the chaos and barked orders for the archers to aim at a singular target rather than firing at the group at random. She ordered the others to fire on specific targets who appeared to be most wounded, knowing that raiders usually fled when their numbers were cut in half. The archers did their best to land precise shots, but the inferior bows they were using made it difficult to strike targets at such range, especially in the thick fog that had descended upon the castle. The archers felled enough raiders to trigger a rout. but only after Megahoof was struck in the chest by a heavy arrow that thankfully ricocheted off one of his ribs. Sapo rushed to render aid. The Adlets were exhausted from having been awoken in the middle of the night to come to the defense of the castle. Many retreated back to their bedchambers, while a few adults stayed up to watch over the children. Despite his injuries, Megahoof continued to chip away at all of the tasks that needed attending. Much of the iguana hide still needed tanning, and he saw that they had run out of tanning liquors. As he fetched wood to boil down for liquors, he also noticed the cords of unprocessed wood was running low as well. Everywhere he looked, more work was needed. Megahoof noticed the finished garments strewn about the tailoring bench, and figured Lazarus was likely nearly finished with a complete set of new clothing. He also realized he hadn't distilled the batches of extract, something he'd set his mind to do after some much-needed rest. Megahoof was right. Lazarus had finished protective gloves and boots, and all that remained was to tailor up a cloak that would be draped over the rest of their body. The cloak pattern was by far the largest and required the most blended fabric, wool, and time to tailor, compared to the rest of the set. The blended fabric was difficult to work with, being dense and tightly woven meant that stitching it properly required thicker thread, which in turn required a wider gauge needle, which required a lot more force to push through the compressed fabric. Despite Klein taking great effort to craft a blend that would be airy, the resulting textile was cumbersome and dense, something Lazarus couldn't imagine wearing under a heavy set of armor. He set the partially finished cloak aside, having strained his hands from the effortful needlework, and headed to bed, imagining the hilarity of wearing trousers and a tunic under his armor made from the blend. He pictured himself struggling to walk, as if he lacked elbow and knee joints, teetering around stiff as a scarecrow. The vast fields of maki and wheat slowly turned more golden in the summer's sun. Sapo and Lazarus let Bash and Shellbell know they weren't planning on sowing any additional crops, at least for now. With the massive harvest of maki and wheat just on the horizon, they'd have plenty of work to be done in the fields. The larders were still mostly empty, especially the shelves designated for nutrifungus and hay, something the farmers were hoping to correct. Klein inquired about the Devil Strand, seeing that much of the rest of the farm was harvested for vegetables, but Sapo told him it hadn't matured enough to be harvested. Hopefully they were headed towards a mild autumn to allow the fungal caps to grow a bit more. Sapo noticed Lazarus finishing up the first protective cloak and checked up on Megahoof. Megahoof's cracked rib was still healing, but the wound looked clean and clear of any infection. Sapo proposed a pseudo-scientific test for their next search for Salix trees. Once his rib and torso had fully healed, he suggested that Megahoof wear an entire set of protective clothing, while he himself would only wear a mask. He'd take careful notes about pollution exposure symptoms at the onset of departure, and then again when they returned to see if the clothing did in fact work as intended. Megahoof agreed with the proposal. Megahoof then asked Sapo, "If the clothing is proved to be effective, will you actually wear it?" And Sapo smiled and shook his head. He replied with, "I'm a cook and a farmer. The only adventures I need are just a day's journey from the castle. The perilous trek to get to this glade was enough bushwhacking to last me a lifetime anyway." Megahoof then replied, "But if you had the chance to return to Hillinor Island?" Sapo shook his head again. There's nothing back there for me. I'm not a fungal farmer, and I certainly don't enjoy sitting around all day bemoaning the fall of our mighty kingdoms. Megahoof understood Sapo's sentiment. The attitudes of many of the islanders back home were a frustrating mix of learned helplessness and willful ignorance. Megahoof's cracked rib no longer ached, and the arrow wound had scabbed fully over. He let Sapo know he felt ready to depart. Sapo looked him over and agreed. He was in good health. Sapo then scrawled detailed notes about their pollution symptoms, checking reaction time, reflexes, capillary refill, pupil dilation, and several other telltale signs of illness. Once Sapo had finished, Megahoof then donned the gloves, boots, and cloak. He felt like he had wrapped himself in a thick carpet. While the fabric was breathable, and it didn't feel like he was overheating, it added bulk, which made it difficult to move and restricted his agility. He immediately knew this was not the sort of clothing to wear to battle, just as Klein warned. Klein looked Megahoof over, and tears welled up in his eyes. Megahoof saw Klein's reaction and said, "I look like your friends you had lost in Pennacook, don't I?" And Klein nodded. Klein cleared his throat and spoke softly. "You don't get to my age without losing many that you hold dear. But even so, seeing you wear Pennacook's scout uniform brings back so many memories." "So it seems Lazarus did a good enough job following the pattern, I take it?" Megahoof said, hoping to add some levity. "To a T, and then some. The stitchwork is superb," Klein replied, and then turned to return to work at the loom and spinning wheel. Megahoof and Sapo breathed a sigh of relief. They happened upon a glade that had both a purified microforest and clean water lake. The pattern of finding Salix trees amongst dead forest had ended. Megahoof was still concerned the extraction of trees from the Catrara forest was at least partially to blame for the polluted meadows, but knowing there were still some purified areas around the keep brought comfort. They rounded up the bison to tether them amongst the tall pine trees northwest of the lake, allowing the bison to drink from the clean water as they walked by. Finding purified areas to tether the bison was crucial, as the bison had to sledge and haul the massive Salix trees, something they did not manage if their health was poor due to pollution exposure. It also allowed them to graze wild grasses and supplement their diet with more variety, which was otherwise boring and nutrient deficient. Sapo hollered at Megahoof that he'd start with the tree adjacent to their makeshift camp. Megahoof waved and headed to fetch an extract for him. Megahoof finished applying a tincture of extract to the roots of the Salix tree, and an overwhelming feeling of fatigue set in, likely a result of being far more encumbered by clothing than he was used to. It seems Sapo was already set up to uproot and extract the next Salix tree, so Megahoof went to fetch bedrolls to make camp. The two were weary from their journey, and since they had found a purified slice of a forest, they decided to rest amongst the pine trees rather than to uproot the final tree, only to become exhausted on their way back home, having to make camp in a polluted swamp or blighted meadow. Megahoof went to grab pumpkin fritters they arrived with, while Sapo was already nestling into his bedroll. After a brief nap, they'd search for the final Salix tree to uproot it before returning home. Back in the castle, the great harvest of wheat was underway, and despite Lazarus's best efforts to instruct Shelvel and Bash on their technique, the two were far too inexperienced to be effective. Luckily, there was enough wheat that the spoilage was acceptable, and was also an important learning experience for the boys so they could become more helpful in the farm fields in the future. Klein felt ready to take a break from the spinning wheel and loom, so he joined the boys in the field and was far more effective at scything wheat than they were, a welcome sight for the overworked Lazarus. The other adlets gathered bushels of wheat to stack them safely in the pantry to keep it from rotting from weather or rodents. The boys rested after a long day of hard work. Despite being achy and worn out, they had a sense of fulfillment, knowing the fruits of their labor was measurable, significant, and appreciated. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights, episode 36, Secrets of Salix. If you have any feedback or questions for me, let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me more directly, please consider joining my Patreon page or Discord server. Links to that can be found in the description. Thank you so very much for watching. Farewell, my fellow adlets.